Alright, moving on to the Lackluster tier, I feel like I need to do some more explaining on my definitions of these tiers. Like I said previously, the bad tier was for bosses where I thought the fights were underwhelming and were somewhat frustrating or just poorly thought out. For the Lackluster tier, I mainly placed fights which I thought were boring, but they were for the most part too easy to really find annoying, therefore giving them a higher placing than the fights from the bad tier. Now, if the Lackluster tier is technically worse than the bad tier is more of a personal preference, and was something that I considered for a while, but eventually I decided on ranking them in this order. I guess I just find it easier to excuse a boring fight than a frustrating or annoying fight. One positive about this tier is that despite there being a lot of bosses, it's not really going to take that long, as there isn't too much to say about each fight. But yeah, let's finally actually get to the first boss, the Witch of Hemwick. The Witch of Hemwick is a really boring fight, so boring that I contemplated putting her into the bad tier. But upon replaying, I felt like that she was so easy it wasn't even worth it. The entire fight boils down to running around and hitting the witch, or it would be the witches. If you have insight when you do this, there are also ads that will spawn, but you can completely avoid this by just using up all your insight before the fight. Even if you do this, it doesn't really matter as the ads are really weak, making the fight extremely easy either way. Not that much more to say about it honestly, so let's just move on to the next fight. This video is long enough as it is already, so instead of writing out a full paragraph of this boss, I'll just sum him up by reading my notes that I wrote as I was replaying the game. Also pretty much a joke fight, super easy, has like 3 moves, bad, boring, not a single clue why they made this boss and placed him where they did. Wild. Last Dragonrider is honestly just a bit of an unfortunate fight, as the most common way of fighting him is by just instantly killing him. I wouldn't really count this towards him though, as it's a way of cheesing him, even if it happens fairly often even when you don't try to do it. Outside of this exploit, there isn't really much to say about him. He has a very slow and bland movesets where he doesn't really do anything but basic swings with his weapon. The most interesting part about this fight is the mechanic where you can raise platforms to make his arena bigger, but even this isn't that interesting. So for the sake of the length of this already way too long video, I'm just going to pair both the Smelter Demons into the same segment, as they are essentially the same boss. On its own, the Smelter Demon isn't even that bad of a fight. Most of my hatred for this boss comes from 2 things. Firstly, he's extremely anti-melee, with both his constant damaging aura, but also his AoE explosions that he does. As someone who only ever does melee, he has been a massive chore to fight for this reason. Secondly, and this technically has nothing to do with the fight, but holy fuck does this boss have the absolute worst run back of any boss in Dark Souls 2. Which says a lot, since Dark Souls 2 occupies like 15 slots in the top 10 worst run backs. By placing as many enemies as they did in front of the frog gate, they pretty much guarantee that you would have to kill a lot of enemies on your way back to the boss every single time. This got so bad that by the time I actually killed the boss, I had killed the mob so many times that they just stopped respawning altogether, so I could actually finally attempt the boss. In total, I would say I spent way more time trying to get to the boss than I ever spent trying to actually defeat the boss. I spent so goddamn long trying to get to this boss that I honestly placed it this low purely out of spite, and I have no problem with that. On their own, the Rune Sentinels are honestly fine. Most of my problems with them stem from the fact that there are 3 of them. I do have some minor gripes with them, like the fact that the first boss you fight sometimes just bug out and jump off the ledge early, forcing you to fight all 3 at once. Rune Sentinels is just another one of those fights where it's a bunch of individual enemies placed in the same room and called a boss fight. They don't really synergize with each other at all, making the fight just a bit boring. At least this one isn't all that hard. Now, the Blazing Bull is one that I would partly take some blame for. When it comes to the Souls games, I'm a bit of a purist. As more of the games have come out and each have had new and different mechanics added to them, I've been a bit of a stubborn old man and refused to really interact with them. So when it comes to Sekiro, I didn't really ever use any of the ninja tools. So when it came to the Blazing Bull, a fight that is made with a certain ninja tool in mind, it does tank the quality to a certain extent. This being said, even with the firecrackers, I don't really think it's a particularly good fight. If you fight it in the proper way, he's just frustrating as he constantly charges at you. But if you do fight him as you were intended with counters and firecrackers, he's a complete joke, making him a case of bad if you do, bad if you don't. Demon of Song is another one of those bosses that doesn't really do anything bad, but doesn't really do anything good either. Summed up, he has a decent moveset with nothing really interesting, just a bunch of slam attacks. He does have a unique mechanic where he'll hide inside his skin, but this just artificially makes the fight longer as you wait for him to come out again. This could have been more interesting if they made him do literally anything during this time, but no, he just kinda sits there. So other than design, he's probably one of the most forgettable bosses in the entire series. Priscilla is another fight where I wasn't really sure if I was going to be including it, but most wikis and people in general seem to classify her as a boss, so I thought I might as well. That being said, I wouldn't really harp on her too much. It's clear that she's just a bit of extra content and you aren't even really meant to fight her at all. Her moveset's okay, her stealth mechanic is actually kinda cool, but the fact that she's extremely squishy, plus her very lacking moveset, makes her an overall lackluster boss. Cute tell though. I'm starting to feel like I'm repeating myself a lot, but this is another boss that suffers from his size. If you fight the giant lord like you fight the last giant, you wouldn't really be able to see what is going on. But much like the last giant, it doesn't really matter as you can just rush the boss down before you can really do anything about it. To be fair to the giant lord, he does have an actual way you're meant to fight him, and that is by fighting him on the ledge next to him. This way your camera is higher and you can actually see everything he does. This does somewhat improve his fight, but it's still really easy. His moveset is way too blunt and pretty much just boils down to him slamming his sword down at you, making him a slightly harder ceaseless. You might have thought that we were done with them, but no, here's yet another ad fight. I've ragged on ad fights enough in this tier list, so I'll just explain why I rate Celestial Emissary higher than the rest and move on. So it basically just boils down to the fact that this fight is in Bloodborne, and the rest aren't. The type of fight just fits better with the faster flow of Bloodborne's combat, making the fight more bearable. It is still an ad fight, so it places pretty low, just not as low as the rest. Crystal Stage is another one of those fights that there isn't really anything wrong with, it's just a bit bare bones mechanics wise. But probably should have been put a bit earlier in the game for how simple she is. Her puzzle mechanic is a neat idea, but it's something a child could figure out at a glance, so it becomes too simple for an entire fight to lean on. It's an okay fight, just a bit boring. My thoughts on Flexile Sentry are very similar to my thoughts on Crystal Sage. The fight itself isn't bad, as there isn't anything in it to make it bad, it just ends up being a bit bland. It has several mechanics to it that I think are really interesting, like it having two upper bodies, which in turn gives it two movesets. The problem is that the fight is so easy that the boss doesn't really get to utilize the mechanic during the fight. You just kinda pick a side and then fight him normally. Same thing with the mechanic of water filling the room as you fight. This is honestly a mechanic that several of you watching this video probably didn't even know about. As the fight goes on, more and more water will fill the room, eventually making it so deep that it slows your movement. It's a neat idea on its own, but it just doesn't get to do anything when the boss dies in a few seconds. Flexile Sentry has several good ideas, they just aren't executed that well. I really hope that FromSoft ends up reusing some of them in their upcoming games. So after a couple of bosses with good mechanics that don't matter, comes a boss with a terrible mechanic that doesn't matter, Mytha. So I'm just going to be blunt, her poison mechanic is just straight up bad. The fight is pretty much undoable if you don't drain the poison first, which isn't really great. Doesn't really make it any better that the way you drain the poison doesn't even make any sense, and most people don't even find out on their own and are either told about it or just look it up. And when you do drain the poisons, she's just another Dark Souls 2 boss, a boss with a really generic moveset that is easy to dodge, making her overall boring. The only reason she ranks higher is because her moveset is slightly more interesting than Flexile Sentry and Crystal Sage, but only by a minuscule amount. You might have expected this fight to be a bit lower, as it is a duo fight that is literally just a boss that has been doubled up and called a boss fight, but I don't really take an issue with the duo aspect of this fight. The main reason I don't is because it's extremely easy to just make the melee Dragonrider knock the ranged one down. From here you just need to kill the ranged Dragonrider, which takes like one combo as he's extremely squishy. After that, you're just left with the exact same boss as the original Dragonrider you've already fought, but with his stats improved, making it for a tiny bit more of an interesting fight. The only reason I place it higher on the list than the original Dragonrider is that by placing two bosses you make it a tiny bit more interesting, but it's by no means an actually good fight, which is why it's still in the lackluster tier. This is another fight where I don't really have much to say about it, which I guess is kind of the point of this tier. The One Reborn in both visual design and combat design is just a giant blob. Fight-wise, all he does is just sometimes kick you with one of his thousands of legs, or uses magic to drown you in sludge. Other than that, you'll just be running around trying to kill all the ads around him, or just laying into him. He's also another one of those bosses who are so big that it's just hard to tell what is happening, but I've talked way too much about that already, so let's just move on. Pinwheel might just be one of the weirdest bosses in Dark Souls 1. There are just so many things about him that doesn't make sense, to the point where I have no idea what FromSoft are thinking. Everything about Pinwheel suggests that he's supposed to be fought decently early, both in the fact that he is extremely simple and the fact that he gives the right of kindling. And if that was the case, then he probably would be a fair amount higher on my list, but the problem is that the game does a plethora of things to stop you from fighting him early. When players first arrive in Firelink, it isn't all that uncommon for them to go to the graveyard first, to then get their ass kicked by the skeletons. Even though it feels like it was intended to deter new players from going to the catacombs first, it also makes it so that there's no way for you to accidentally stumble upon Pinwheel early. I don't know, Pinwheel isn't even that bad of a fight if you fight him at an appropriate level. He actually gets to use his clones, and the fight can even become somewhat difficult if you don't kill him fast enough. Problem is that realistically that's never going to happen, as you're always going to fight him when you're way over leveled, as you're actively discouraged from actually going here before you get the Lord Vessel. I wish I could place him higher, but as it stands, he's just a wasted fight. Weirdly enough for how high I placed Capra Demon in the Lackluster tier, I was actually contemplating putting him in the bad tier instead. This mostly comes down to his fight at the same time being lackluster, but also just straight up annoying. One-on-one, the Capra Demon is a fairly easy fight, and most players, even early on, would have no problem taking him on. The problem is when you put him into the arena he is in. The two most obvious problems with the fight are the two dogs he has with him, and the arena itself. The dogs are less annoying as they die quite fast, but this is somewhat reliant on RNG since they can be irritating and constantly jump away from you. The bigger issue is the arena and how insanely small it is. Not only do you need to fight the Capra Demon and his dogs, but you also have to fight with your own camera to be able to see anything. In the end, the reason why I ended up putting him in the Lackluster tier instead of the bad tier is that the fight, despite the dogs and the arena, is really easy. The stairs are in the arena makes splitting him up from the dogs easy, and it was also really useful for creating distance between you to heal. If it weren't for these stairs, I most likely would have put him in the bad tier though. Just as with Celestial Emissary, I don't really have much to say about the living failures that I haven't already said several times already, so I'll just explain why I think it's a better fight than Celestial Emissary and move on. The main reason I think it's a better fight overall is just that they're bigger and therefore less of them. It isn't as much of a slaughter as it is against Celestial Emissary, where I'm essentially just R1 spamming a bunch of small dudes until the big dude spawns. Still, the fight is pretty boring. The enemies themselves are really simple, and dodging the big meteor attack they do is really easy, and only slightly lengthens the fight. Not the worst at fight, but it's still a lackluster fight overall. Elana's a bit of a weird one, and one I think most people would disagree with me on. On paper, Elana's not a terrible fight. Her mechanical spawning attribute to fight is fairly interesting, but it's the way it's done where the fight starts falling apart. Basically, Elana has two options when it comes to what she can spawn. Either it's a group of skeletons that you can kill in one hit, or Velstad, a literal boss from earlier in the game. I think you can start and see where I'm going with this. When Elana spawns the skeletons, I think her fight is fine. Her own attacks are decently fun to play against, and the skeletons just add a bit more difficulty on top, but not too much. All my problems with this fight comes from when Velstad is spawned. I don't know what they were thinking with this fight, but Velstad spawns in with pretty much the same health and damage as the actual boss fight. This combined with the fact that Elana is very much there and still very much attacking you makes this fight hell. You have the option of either killing Velstad or just running around until he despawns, but both of these are probably just going to end with Elana resummoning him again. This leaves the fight a pretty much a coin flip if it's an average fight that isn't that interesting, or one of the most frustrating fights in the entire game. This is why I eventually ended up putting her in the lackluster category, as it's somewhat in the middle of the two options. Let me just start off this segment by saying that I think Nito is really cool. His design is awesome. The fact that he's just a bunch of clumped up skeletons is pretty dope. The way he slowly lurks over to you as this hulking mass while using massive AoE spells is both terrifying and looks amazing. Everything presentation and lore wise is just superb, but then you actually fight him and oh boy is he disappointing. There are a lot of things I hate about this fight, so I'll try to be brief with each one. First up, you have to lose about half your HP every single time you start the fight, as there's no way to avoid taking full damage. The other very obvious thing are the skeletons that are in his arena. Other than making a divine weapon, there isn't really anything you can do about them other than just hoping that Nito kills them for you, and you can get in attacks while they put themselves together. Since, you know, you can't permanently kill skeletons in Dark Souls 1 without a divine weapon. This one's a bit more minor, but it's still very annoying your first time fighting him, and that is Nito's Scream attack. Basically, Nito will sometimes scream, and after a certain delay, a soul will come out from the ground right under you, which will hit you no matter what unless you perfectly time a roll. On its own, this isn't that bad, but it's still an undodgeable attack until you get hit by it by a certain amount of times so you can learn the timing. So it ends up feeling like a pretty cheap attack compared to the rest of the game. And honestly, the worst part is, even if you remove all of these aspects from the fight and just fight him one-on-one, he's a really lackluster fight. He barely has any moves. It's like 2 different swings of his sword and then his worst attack where he sends out a big AoE around him, and if you're melee, you have no choice but to run away and then run back. Sometimes when you do this, he'll just cast it straight away again, making it so you can't even attack him for like 20-30 seconds at a time. It's honestly such a shame that a boss this cool got butchered so badly in his fight design. My boy Nito deserved so much better than this. Despite not being the highest, or I guess lowest, boss in the lackluster tier, he might just be the most lackluster boss in the tier. Just in case you don't know, the way you fight Yhorm is that you're given a special sword that shoots a giant wind current, which is basically the only realistic way you're killing him. On its own, I don't think this gimmick is that bad, and FromSoft will try this gimmick again later and do much better. but we'll get to that a bit later in the list. The main problem with how the Yhorm fight uses this gimmick is that it makes it way too easy. Every time you hit Yhorm with a special attack, it stuns him for a very long time, making so you can very easily just charge up the attack again and simply stun lock Yhorm until he's dead. So as a Souls fight, I think Yhorm is extremely lackluster, though he does somewhat succeed in being a good spectacle fight, which is the main reason I place him this high. I feel a bit bad for the folding screen monkeys. As a concept, the fight is honestly pretty good. It utilizes the new movement system in Sekiro with unlimited stamina and a grappling hook really well. The way you defeat the monkeys is varied and fits each monkey really well. My absolute favorite part is the fourth monkey though. Making it invisible, as it is often the forgotten about monkey, is honestly really quite clever. After all that praise, you might be a bit confused as to why I placed it so low, and it mostly comes down to execution. While I think the way you defeat each monkey is clever, I don't think it's communicated to the player all that well. This leads to the fight devolving into players just running around chasing monkeys until they either get lucky and accidentally do the correct mechanic, or the AI bug and it lets you kill the monkey without it. If the fight had more of a lead up and hints from earlier in the game, I honestly think it might have been one of the best gimmick fights in the series, but instead it's just one of the fights with the most wasted potential. Freja is another one of those bosses which I originally didn't really mind, but my opinion on drastically dropped after fighting them again. My memory of my first time fighting them was okay. I remember somewhat struggling, but it felt fair and I didn't really have any problems with it overall. But after having more experience with different FromSoft games, I think it just hit home just how bland and simple the fight really is. First off are the ads, which are just kinda there. They don't really add anything to the fight except just being a bit annoying. Freja herself is not really much better though. She does have the mechanic though of having two heads, and if you focus one too much, it just kinda falls off, forcing you to switch to the other one, which is admittedly pretty neat. Other than that, she's just extremely simple. She has like 3 attacks that she'll use and all of them are just really easy to dodge. I think it's a bit of a shame as the build up to the fight and her design are both done pretty well, but once again, Dark Souls 2 just drops the balls when it comes to the actual fight itself. Finally we get to the final boss in the Lackluster tier, and coincidentally it's another spider boss. Well, I swear it's not my inner arachnophobia showing or anything, the bosses are just not that great. Well, despite taking the highest spot in the tier, I don't actually have that much to say about Rom, but I guess that makes sense given the tier. He is quite similar to Freja in the sense that he's just a big spider surrounded by other smaller spiders. I do think he's better than Freja though, in that Bloodborne just straight up has the better gameplay and that his attacks are more varied and therefore more interesting to fight. Though the ads are pretty much the same as in Freja's fight. They're just kinda there and don't really do much. Maybe you'll take a quick break from spamming R1 on the boss to clear out a few of them once in a while, but that's about it. There honestly isn't that much more of a difference between the two, both are just very lackluster fights. There you have it, the entire Lackluster tier. I'll put it up on screen so you can see it in its entirety. I probably shouldn't say this considering that's my own video and my own list, but this is probably the least interesting of the tiers. There isn't really anything to talk about with any of the fights, so I kinda just speedrun through it. Next up we have the OK tier, which despite its name should be a lot more interesting as there are some fights where I feel like I will get a little bit hate for. Also sorry if the voiceover feels a bit inconsistent, a lot of the audio was recorded months apart as I was struggling with motivation to get stuff done, but it feels great to finally be done. I'll try to get through the rest of the tiers at a much higher pace, so be on the lookout for the next tier within a couple of weeks. But yeah, that'll do it for now. Thank you for watching, bye.